In this video, I'm going to discuss multi-channel capture. You can use this feature to acquire image sets with multiple channels and movies with multiple channels. You can do this both with automated light sources or with manual microscopes. An essential prerequisite of multi-channel capture is that you have the multi-channel capture module licensed and available. You can check this from the Help menu by selecting About Image Pro and the Licenses tab. And here you can see that I have multi-channel capture available. It's also worth checking that your device is correctly configured and that any required drivers are installed. So here I'm just doing a quick search for the device manager, which I'm opening, and I'm checking under the ports category that I'm seeing what I expect to see in this case, which is two QLED USB virtual serial ports. It's also essential that you select the appropriate light source model in the application options. So from the File menu, select Options, and then from the Capture options, select the option to enable multi-channel capture. Choose the correct model of light source, and if appropriate, select the correct port. So here you can see multi-channel capture is enabled. I've set the model to the PE300, and I've chosen the correct port. If all those settings are correct, you should see 4 channels appear in the capture panel. We can then go on to configure those channels. So if we select the Settings tab of the capture panel and then look for Configure Channels, you can also access this by clicking on one of the channels. We see the channel setup controls. So first, setting up the channel labeled Setup 1, I can set the dye and the excitation wavelength. So in this case, I've set my dye to DAPI, and therefore I've set the excitation wavelength to 365 nanometers. Next, I'm going to select the channel which is currently labeled Setup 2, and I'm going to select an appropriate excitation wavelength and dye. And in this case, what I've selected is I've set the dye to FITC, and therefore I've set the excitation wavelength to 450 nanometers. Next, I move on to select the channel currently labeled Setup 3, again selecting the appropriate wavelength and dye. So in this case, I've set the dye to TRITC, and therefore I've set the excitation wavelength to 550 nanometers. Finally, I'm going to select the channel currently labeled Setup 4, and I'm going to select an excitation wavelength and a dye. And slightly differently this time, I've set the excitation wavelength to manual control and set the dye to bright field. All this means is that whenever I select this channel, Image Pro will tell me to manually activate the channel, and whenever I deselect it, Image Pro will tell me to manually deactivate the channel. With everything correctly configured, I can go on to set up my acquisition. So firstly, I'm selecting the correct objective. That'll be stored as metadata with any image sets. And then when I select a channel, I can make changes to the light source power control or the camera controls, and these settings will become associated only with the selected channel. So here with DAPI selected, I can change the power and the camera exposure, and those new settings become associated just with the DAPI channel. Then I can select the FITC channel, so here I'm adjusting exposure and the gain. And finally, I can select the TRITC channel, and here I'm increasing the gain and then setting an appropriate exposure time. The next thing I want to do is select the Acquire option from the drop-down menu of each of the channels I've just configured. And with that option set for each channel, I can select Capture, and Image Pro automatically acquires a 3-channel image set for me. And in this case, I'm going to save it because I'm happy with it, and I'm going to save it as OME-TIFF, which is a great format for multi-channel image sets. Now, I don't necessarily have to work quite so hard in setting my exposures. I can select the Auto Exposure option from the drop-down menu of each channel. All I have to do is select this option for each of the channels I wish to acquire, and then click Capture. Now first, Image Pro goes through a cycle of calculating exposure for each of the channels, after which it goes on to acquire the channels. Here's a second example where I'm using auto exposure to calculate the exposure time. So I'm making sure auto exposure is selected for each of my channels, and then I click capture, and Image Pro does the hard work of calculating the exposure times for me, and it then applies those newly calculated exposure times to each of the channels of my image set. Thanks for joining me for this short video. I hope you found it useful. If you have any questions, please contact Media Cybernetics and we'll be happy to help.